Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with lace skirt dumplings. That's right, the best way to dress up a plate of frozen dumplings or pot stickers is with this easy to make gorgeous crispy skirt, which not only makes our dumplings way more fashionable, but also more delicious and fun to eat. And to get started, we have to mix up what's called a slurry, which always starts with some kind of liquid, which is usually water. But for this first version, I wanted to try chicken broth. But no matter the liquid, to this we will add some flour, plus in my case a couple shakes of cayenne, and then we'll take a whisk and give this a thorough mix. And by the way, in a recent meatball video, I called the breadcrumb and milk mixture we made a slurry, but as I've already publicly admitted, that was actually a panade. Oh yeah, I misspoke, and what we're making here is actually a slurry. But anyway, once mixed, we will set that aside until we need it. And if you make this ahead, make sure you give it a very good whisking before you pour it in the pan. Speaking of which, on the stove we have a nonstick pan set over medium-high heat, to which we will add some vegetable oil, as well as a little touch of sesame oil, for a little more flavor and that little touch of nuttiness. And once we've swirled that around a little bit, we'll go ahead and start transferring our frozen dumplings in, which really could be anything, as long as they're frozen, and they have at least one flat side. And for this first attempt, I'm going to place in 8. And I'm positioning those with the curved side going in the same direction. Not that it would really matter, but if we have one or two going the other way, it might bother some people. Oh yeah, you know who you are. But anyway, once those were placed in and positioned and sizzling nicely, I went ahead and poured in the chicken broth slurry, at which point I covered this tightly and I let it steam about 3 minutes, which is just about how long it takes for these frozen dumplings to thaw and heat through. All right, don't forget everything inside's already cooked. So we are basically just needing to brown them. And that's it. After about 3 minutes, I took off the lid. And as you can see, our lace skirt is already starting to form. And at this point, I reduced my heat to medium, since we don't want things to get too dark and charred before this is ready to remove from the pan. And before we can do that, we basically have to wait for all the moisture in the slurry to evaporate, and for our skirt to crisp up and release from the pan. And if one part of the pan seems to be cooking faster than another, don't be afraid to rotate things to hopefully even it out. But anyway, like I said, I waited for things to dry out and brown up. And I know at this point it looks like it's too dark, but as you'll see, it was not. And that's it. Once our skirt is dark and crisp, and we're able to move it around a little bit, we will very carefully remove this from the pan by placing a plate over the top. And as I turn this, I'm actually going to freeze the frame, since there's always going to be a little bit of oil that drips out between the plate and the pan, and we want to be very sure that no part of our hand or arm or any other appendages are going to be anywhere near where that drips out, which if you flip it as shown shouldn't happen, but I did want to point that out so you're very careful. And that's it. We'll grab a paper towel and do a little bit of cleanup. And as I mentioned, even though that looked really dark in the pan, it actually toasted up to a perfect crispy golden brown. And you're probably thinking, sure, it looks crisp. But is it really crisp? Well, yes, it is. Oh yeah, fork don't lie. And that's it. Once our dumplings are dressed in their lace skirt, we can go ahead and break those into sections. And we can sort of eat them like crispy little tacos. And as far as the sauce goes, I just did a very simple soy, rice vinegar, sriracha mix. And after I had those flipped over, I applied some of that and went in for the official bite. And besides the amazing crowd-pleasing appearance, the added flavor and crispy texture this adds to the dumpling really does elevate it beautifully, since now instead of having just one crispy side of the dumpling, we are basically surrounding it with crispiness. Which reminds me, do not spoon your sauce over the top of them like this. I was just hungry and not thinking straight. Right, what we really want to do is dip these into the sauce one at a time, so we don't have our crispy bits getting soft on the plate. But anyway, that was attempt number 1, and I moved on to version number 2, which I decided to try with a basic water slurry, which is nothing more than water, flour, and some salt. Oh, and if you're gluten-free, I know that there are versions of this that use rice flour or cornstarch or a combination, so check those out if you can't do wheat flour. But anyway, once that was mixed, I went back to the stove, and I placed another set of dumplings in my hot pan. And by the way, pro tip, make sure you scrape off any ice crystals from the bottom of the dumplings before you place them in your hot oil so you don't get all this splattering, which is just one of the ways the food gods will teach us a lesson. And yes, for this version I used 7 instead of 8 dumplings, since I wanted a little higher skirt ratio. And also for this version, I decided to cover and cook the dumplings for a couple minutes first, before pouring the slurry in, since I wanted to get a little more browning on the dumplings themselves, so that visually we would have a little bit of a contrast between the bottoms of those and the rest of the skirt. So I covered those and cooked them without the slurry for a few minutes, at which point I uncovered and then gave the pan a little bit of a tilt to kind of even out the oil, which I'm not sure worked or is even necessary, but I did it anyway. At which point I poured my water-based slurry in. And once you do this, you have a couple seconds where you can rearrange the dumplings if they've moved out of place. And that's it, since we already browned and steamed our dumplings before we added the slurry. I'm going to finish this one completely uncovered. And just like the first version I showed you, we're waiting for that moisture to evaporate and for our skirt to get nice and crispy and lacy. And this water-based slurry did not get as dark as the broth-based one, which is probably because there's more protein in the broth. And also, when I thought it was just about done, the edges didn't seem to be releasing from the pan like the first version. So I took the edge of a spatula to try to break the seal, and I was a little too aggressive when I started, since we don't want to be breaking off big pieces of the skirt. But anyway, I went around, giving it a little nudge here and there, until it finally did release from the pan, and I could tell it was going to come off cleanly, at which point we'll perform the exact same dismount by placing the plate over the top and carefully flipping it over. And as you can see, by browning the dumplings first and then adding the slurry, I think we get a better contrast and possibly more interesting appearance. But anyway, that kind of stuff is subjective, and I thought both versions looked great. And for this one, I decided to garnish with some fresh chives. Then I grabbed a fork to make sure this was just as crispy, which as you can hear, it was. And then as far as the eating experience goes, this was pretty much identical to the first version. Okay, I really couldn't tell a big difference between the broth and the water. Although if you do use water, since it's not seasoned, don't forget to add that nice big pinch of salt. And this time I used the sauce correctly, and I dipped my dumplings in one at a time, which is probably a smarter way to go. And if I had to pick between the two versions and the two methods, I would go with this second one. Alright, I think browning the dumplings first before you add the slurry is a good idea, since it came out just as crispy, but with what I thought was a better appearance. But anyway, I showed you both, so you'll have to decide. I mean, you are after all the merry quant of using what you want. And speaking of mini skirts, you could do a smaller version of this, just using 2 or 3 dumplings in a small pan, by just scaling down the amount of your slurry. And the technique should work out pretty much exactly the same. But whether you scale this down or not, I think this is a really fun, very easy, and visually fascinating way to jazz up dumplings. And I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.